here? Buddy, there was a bunch of them, wasn't there? Good grief. It's way too much. It's overkill.
Okay, we've talked about a lot of fun things here the last few weeks. We've talked dinosaurs. We've talked aliens. We've talked meteors crashing into the peninsula of southern Mexico. We've talked all kinds of interesting things in correlation to the supernatural and unveiling creation. Tonight we may talk monkeys a little bit. I've been looking forward to tonight. Let me tell you, before we peruse days 5 and 6, we're going to do a little backwards tonight. We're going to read these passages, and we're going to talk about the spiritual content, and then we're going to back up and do the natural last, kind of the opposite of what we've been doing. And I want you to know there's going to be huge benefit in this for you tonight. First of all, if you are a person who your faith wavers at all, or you ever battle the what ifs, and is this really real, and is this God thing real? I'm telling you, tonight you're about to get your faith bolstered big time with where we're going. The second thing is if you have friends who are atheist or agnostic, or just not sure of a lot of things when it comes to God and His role in this earth, you're going to be so much more well-armed to have conversation with them after tonight. So if you take notes, you may want to take some notes. If not, just tell them to go to YouTube and watch it for themselves, which they probably won't do, but you can suggest it. All right, here we go. Genesis chapter 1, beginning with verse 20. Let's read days 5 and 6. And you can just listen to me read, obviously. I don't have a Burl Ives voice, but we'll get through it. Or Charlton Heston. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the waters teem, according to their kinds, very key, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning the 5th day. And so what happened on day 5 literally was He created fish and birds, basically, right? Everything that's in the oceans and the seas and the rivers and the ponds and everything that flies in the air. Not the creepy crawly things yet, but everything that flies and everything in the deep. And so what you need to be seeing, as we talked about last week, going back to day 3, you need to see that life is increasing, okay? And the complexity of life is increasing. Day 6, it goes into verse 24, and it says, "And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds." Why do you think God is just being so redundant about this? Do you think that somehow in God's foreknowledge He knew that man was going to wrestle with this a little bit? Where did all these kinds come from? And did this kind come from that kind, which came from that kind? Did you ever pay attention to the redundancy here? God is going out of His way to make us understand everything that existed as it was from the very beginning, and it can only reproduce more of its own kind. It's like God's preparing for days when He knows that the human intellect was going to begin to dabble in strange realms. God made the wild animals, all this stuff, and God saw that it was good. Now, He wasn't done on day 6. He was going to create man in His image, but that's for another day, for another night, maybe next Wednesday night. But right now, we're just going to talk about all these creatures. And I want you to pay close attention to the things that God is being specific about. First of all, on day 5, God is only creating the creatures that fly and the creatures that swim into the deep. He's creating high things. He's creating very low things. He's creating things that represent realms. It's obvious in the natural. There's the literal heavens where things fly. There's the literal depths where things swim. And on day 6, he's creating the realm right in the middle where things crawl and things walk. And when we read this, we can be as small children and just say, okay, this is what he did. It's that simple, and I'm not going to analyze it. But I suggest to you that God wants us to analyze it. God wants us to get into his mind. If God takes the time to tell us something, God expects us to mentally, intellectually evolve to a place of intrigue and curiosity. How many of you guys are curious about things in life and have been since you were a child? Why do you think that is? Did we become curious because of the sin nature, or did we become curious because of the God nature in us? That we wonder about things. And we look at things and little boys just have to tear things apart to see what it looks like when it's not whole, because they're trying to figure out how it worked. And I don't know how many little girls do things like that. Probably not too many little girls walk around tearing the heads off their Barbie dolls. I used to tear the heads off my Barbie dolls, and yes, I had Barbie dolls. I was advanced. I wasn't feminine. I was an advanced male. And I've told you before, my mom will vouch for this. I try not to tell stories when she's around, but she will vouch for this because this is a story she always told of the church that we went to, that they got mad at the pastor and quit and left that church because I was bringing naked babies to church with me, and he told my parents I was demon-possessed. Now, a parent's not going to receive that very well. If someone told you that your child was demon-possessed and needed to have an exorcism just because they played with naked babies, you might have issue with that. My parents did, and they left. I was not demon-possessed. I was advanced. That's all. I was curious, wonder what this head would look like on this body. God wants us to be curious. He wants us to wonder. David, a man after God's own heart. And we say that backwards sometimes. He had a heart after God. Yeah, he did, but look at the specifics of it. He was a man after God's own heart. The heart biblically represented thoughts and emotions. He was saying David is a man who doesn't just sit around wondering about himself in his little world. David wonders about me. David wonders why I do what I do. He wonders what I'm thinking. David wonders what I'm feeling in situations. God was head over heels in love with David. And David was as imperfect as the day is long. What does that tell you about God? He's not like us. We look for perfection. We measure by perfection. Clearly, with David, God was not using that as a measuring rod on any level, because that dude was messed up. But he loved David because David was curious about God. Put yourself in God's shoes. All these millions and billions of people in the earth, past, present, and future, and almost every single one of them, even the ones that believe in God, it's still about them. Does God know how I feel? God knows how I think. That can be good and bad, right? So we either worry and we're feeling guilty, or we're happy because God knows how I'm feeling right now. It's always about God knowing about us. David stood out in the crowd because it wasn't just about what God could do for David. David was wondering about God. That tells me God wants us to be curious. When we look at things like the creation story, and God says, yeah, on day 5 I created the birds of the air and the fish of the deep. Yeah. All right, let's move on to day 6. On day 6, I created the things in the middle that roam on the ground, in between the high and the low. God knows most people just read that and go, okay, let's move on to day 7. But he knows that if his spirit can get involved in our spirit, it's going to stir up curiosities. And we're going to go, wait a minute now. He just spoke of 3 different realms, 3 different realms. It's going to come into play next week when we talk about the authority that was given over to man to rule in 3 realms. It's going to make even more sense. I don't want to talk much about it tonight, but I want you to see that God intentionally created 3 realms of creatures that would later be ruled over by man. 3 realms, the 3rd realm, the 3 rooms, 3 parts of man. You're already starting to put some of this together. I can smell it. I smell the brain cells burning in here. This is the story mostly, in its, spiritually speaking, in its most simplistic form. What God wants us to see, I believe, is that with the progression of days of God being involved in life, and we've talked about that. The creation story represents the earth. It also represents those who are made from the dust of the earth. We start out in chaos, in darkness, filled with emptiness, but the Spirit of God is hovering there, waiting for an opportunity to begin to speak. And as God begins to speak, He begins to bring order into our lives. He begins to separate some things. For 3 days, God is separating this and separating that and separating that. He's shining some light so we can see what's going on. And as early as the 3rd day, a day of resurrection, a day of new life, life begins to show up. It was just plant life. It was very simple. Simplest cells in life are found in plants. Wasn't anything complicated. It was just simple life. But even with that simple life, there was fruit. It was producing fruit. And when we go into day 5, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, very complex life forms compared to plants. But how many of you guys understand biology enough to know that the birds of the sea and the birds of the air and the birds of the sea, ducks. I had to spin that quick, Mark. Boy, I'm quick on my feet tonight. The fish and the life in the oceans and the birds, that is simple life forms compared to livestock. You take a fish, there's not a whole lot biologically going on in a fish compared to a cow. You see? And so spiritually, I think what God is wanting us to see is that with each day that we're walking out with Him from glory to glory, He's changing us. And the deeper we walk into those days with Him towards that place of rest and peace, that life is getting more abundant. And Jesus said, I've come to give you life and life abundant, right? But that abundant life, if you've been walking with God for a while, and many of you here have, you know that the abundant life of Jesus Christ did not suddenly happen when you gave your life to Him, you went to the altar, you did whatever you did. You didn't suddenly go back to your chair going, man, my life is so full now. Your happiness was full, your joy was full, but you went back home to the same life that you had before you came to church that morning. If you were struggling in your marriage, you were probably still struggling in your marriage. Finances, probably still struggling there, wherever you were struggling. But what happened, if you kept walking those days out with God, there was an increase of life, and the life started getting bigger and bigger, more abundant, more abundant. And I think that's the simplest spiritual message that God is trying to show us through these days. As the creatures are created, with every day, it's becoming more complex, more abundant. So that's the spiritual picture that I want you to be expectant of. Because if you've only been walking with God for a little while, and you say, you know what, everyone told me it was going to be different, that it was just going to be great, it was going to be better than Disney World if I give my heart to Jesus. And I've given Him 6 weeks now, and it just doesn't seem to be happening for me. That word day, we haven't talked about it yet. We're going to talk about it here within the next couple weeks. It's the word yom, and it can mean 24-hour period. It can mean season. I think it's just an irrelevant point personally to try to split hairs with it, because I think the bottom line, God's just trying to say whether it's a day is in the day of the Lord or it's a day in a 24-hour period. I think God's just trying to say that, you know what, you got to walk this thing out. And day after day after day, it's going to increase. If you're here tonight and you said, you know what, I've given God a shot at this, it's been 3 months now, and I don't see that much changing. Don't throw the towel in. Take the towel, wipe off the sweat, and keep going. Walk deeper into these days, because what you're going to see, take it from at least this guy, even though there's others here that have great experience with the Lord. My mom's been serving God many, many, many years. I can promise you the fruit of God's kingdom only increases its harvest as you walk with God. Not just go to church, not just do the cultural Christian thing. I'm talking about develop a walk with God. Problems don't always cease, and they won't. They're there for a purpose, to try us and to whittle us and sharpen us. But I'm telling you, the quality of life gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger as we walk with God. Trust me. Don't turn and run the other way. Run to Him and watch this life increase. Okay. That's the spiritual picture. Okay? Now, can we go back to the natural? The natural is much more fun than the spiritual, don't you think? I wanted to do this backwards tonight because we need to take more time. Usually we take the natural and we go, here's what happened and here's kind of neat. But then we need a lot more time to try to talk about here's what God's trying to show us spiritually in that. But tonight I want to deal with something in the natural that has all kinds of bearing on the spiritual. How you see this and what God is doing with the creation of the critters will have everything in the world to do with your faith. If it's great faith or if it's weak faith. If it's faith that can stand through incredible storms and not be shaken, or if it's faith that all it takes is one conversation and suddenly you're just not sure what's true about anything anymore. This is stuff that you need to have settled in your heart, and not just settled, but remember it, keep looking back at it, because it will undergird your faith big time. All your faith in God will stem from what we're going to talk about in day 5 and day 6 tonight. So we see God is creating, and God is being very, very intentional to say, and they reproduced after their own kind. They only produced their kind. If it was a frog, that's all the frog could produce, is other frogs. God's being very, very intentional about this. But today we have three very clear schools when it comes to where all this came from, specifically life. And we are part of that life, but before we were, there were frogs, right? So that's the thought. Before this life was here, there was other life. There's 3 primary schools. Obviously, there's creationism. Creationism is the one that takes the least amount of faith. It simply just says, well, I read the story in the Bible, God did this, and that makes pretty good sense if you believe in God, right? If you believe in God, then you believe in the creation story. If you don't believe in the creation story, then how do you believe in God, right? So, creationism. What we're going to talk about tonight, we're not doing because we feel like we're having to convince anybody here tonight to be a creationist. I'm pretty sure everybody in this room is a creationist unless one of y'all brought your agnostic buddies and said, well, you need to hear this. And if you did, I welcome you tonight. And not just tonight, but I'd love to have lunch with you. And I won't even argue with you. I'd love to hear your side of things also, by the way. Second school of thought is evolutionists, of course. Evolution was not invented by Charles Darwin. It started much earlier than that, back in the ancient Greek empires. Evolution was being tossed around with the great philosophers of their day. And Charles Darwin was just the one who grabbed hold of it around the mid-1800s and to begin to kind of formalize it more into a theory, a scientific theory. Okay. The third school, which is reasonably new, and it is the school that schools are beginning to embrace, is called intelligent design. How many's heard that terminology before? Intelligent design has actually came from the study of evolution, where because of the things that was looked at that we're going to talk about tonight, people ended up saying, all right, well, that clearly isn't what happened. So what did happen? And so intelligent design, it's just a matter of who you are, how you would support it. intelligent design probably comes more from an agnostic. And if you don't know what it means to be agnostic, it means that your theory is that you know all this there wasn't just a big bang and all of it existed, that there's clearly an intelligent design behind this. But you may not go so far as to say, and God is that intelligent designer. So agnostics are quick to say, I believe there's something out there, I just don't know what it is. Okay? But it doesn't just stop there with intelligent design, because intelligent design is also supported by creationists who understand that in the school systems, they're not going to teach the creation story of the Bible, and they're okay with schools teaching intelligent design because the hope is that it'll become abundantly obvious at some point to these students that there has to be something behind the intelligence. There's not just this aura of intelligence looming out there in the universe somewhere. I personally have no problem with intelligent design being taught in schools because I think that America still has enough influence with creation teaching that it's going to be easy for people to put two and two together. What do you want your kid taught? They're not going to be taught the creation story unless your kid is in Bible in the schools, at which point you need to be sewing into Bible in the schools. You can bring me your checks, I'll make sure they get in the right place. I took a big one to Straley today and gave a big one to the middle school last week. This church believes the priority in our missions and our evangelism is keeping Bible in the schools in Mercer County. Everything else is very small compared to that. And we're sowing into 8 different nations right now. But this is our nation. So, intelligent design is where things are beginning to move to because the science of evolution is beginning to unravel. And just as there are many old legalistic things still being taught in the body of Christ, and I've tried to tell you, leave it alone. It's dying with the generation, literally. I want you to also know that evolution probably is going to die out with a generation because the human intellect pushes and pushes and pushes, and we only live with gaps for so long. And if we don't fill those gaps with something sensible, we tend to lose interest in things. And so that's what's beginning to happen with evolution right now. Okay, so evolution is what we're going to deal with tonight, right? And I'm going to show you a couple things, a couple primary holes in the evolution theory, and I'm going to pose some questions that we should be posing to the evolutionists that they will admit that they cannot answer, will not even attempt to answer. Any one of these questions is enough to completely dismantle evolution. But when you look at the whole series of questions, it begins to look ridiculous. And that's why science is starting to say, yeah, that's not really adding up. And other people are looking at it going, man, I didn't think I could do this creationist thing because of this faith, but Lord have mercy. It's going to take me a whole lot more faith to grab onto this other thing. But the problem is you've got a whole other group, Glenn, of people out there who are not thinkers. So you guys are thinkers. You do not represent the norm out there. Most people do not really set and intentionally think about too many things like this. And that's too bad. All right, here's some holes in evolution. And I would encourage you guys to go out and research some of this stuff even more, because the more you research it yourself and you see it for yourself, the more it's going to be established in you where you can have good conversation with other people about it. Here's the first hole in no particular order. There are no fossils to support what we call progressive change. Just to make sure you guys understand what evolution is based on, Charles Darwin, it's based on natural selection and gene mutation. Okay? Natural selection means that because of environmental pressures, some things live and some things die. Some things evolve to the point where they become strong and they become dominant species. Other things cannot evolve enough and they die because of the environmental pressures. Gene mutation is the thought that the DNA inside of a creature can begin to mutate and change to the degree where a mud puddle becomes a frog becomes a monkey becomes a man. Okay? So evolution is based on those simple things right there. Okay? Just natural selection and gene mutation. That's what it's based on. And I was going to read this before we started this with creationism, with evolution. Hebrews 11:4, right? No, 11:3. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. Creationism in a nutshell, right? Evolution. Okay. One of the first holes is that there are no fossils. No fossils have been found to support progressive change. All fossils that have been found are complete forms. There's no transitional forms that's ever been found with fossils. Someone can look at it and can just say, well, that was a transition between this and this. But scientists look at fossils and they see complete organisms. They see complete creatures. They don't see things that's in a transitional stage that's got some useless flopping appendage somewhere, like something that's trying to form as a wing, or some extra limb that's just flopping around. They find no fossils like that. And fossils, of course, science will chase fossils back millions of years. And if you were here early on in the creation study, we showed support why that could be. Because between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, there's a huge something happening in there. And it clearly seems to be speaking of a recreation. The earth became void. It became chaotic. The words there are very clear and very intentional. So it opens up the doors. We don't have to be in denial about the existence of dinosaurs. And we don't have to be stupid and say, well, dinosaurs existed back in Noah's day and he put them all on the ark. Well, why would God have him save something that was only going to disappear, months later? You see, you got to use some human logic here. We don't have to argue with science. Science is our best friend. Pure science, true science, is a creationist's best friend. Okay? There are no fossils to support progressive change. Second hole in evolution. Evolutionists never speculate or discuss where the basic compounds and elements in the earth come from to support life. I'm sure not going through the list. How many elements are there? I don't even remember. Anybody here remember how many elements there are? Remember your elements chart from high school? Many of those elements inside of the human body, not just the human body, but other animals. The compounds and the elements, iron, barium, chlorophyll in plants, oxygen and carbon dioxide that's essential to support plant and animal life, the many different kinds of acids that are inside of a living creature. Evolutionists never, ever even try to take a guess where the compounds and the elements came from to support life to begin with. They just don't touch it. Now, doesn't it stand to reason that before life could exist, that which is needed to support life has to come from somewhere? Does it just automatically exist? Is there a Big Bang? And suddenly out of the Big Bang, all of the elements and all of the compounds just happen to magically exist to support life? Automatically, there's oxygen and there's carbon dioxide and there's chlorophyll for plants and there's all these acids and iron and even silver that's inside of the human, and just all these things, they just happen to exist. Evolutionists never speculate or discuss where any of this comes from. They just are doing what they accuse us of doing. They're in denial about the whole thing. They just don't talk about it. It's very interesting that most people that accuse someone else of being in denial, if you look back the other way, they're usually in denial of even more. So here's some questions that evolutionists never answer. that scientifically must be answered for evolution to become a legitimate theory. Now, with that said, how many of you guys understand that when we toss around the word evolution, that we're just shortening the whole phrase? It is the theory of evolution. Even when it's taught in schools, and even though intelligent design is hopefully right around the corner, it is not mainstream yet. Evolution is still very much mainstream. But sometimes we forget that it is the theory of evolution. You tell me, is theory fact? It's a supposed fact, right? It's an assumed fact. We can't prove it. It's a theory. It's just a theory. Here's what we think. Well, those who operate within the theory of evolution, here are questions that never get answered, that have to be answered for this to be seen as more than just a theory full of holes. We'll start out simple and obvious here. Question is simply this: how did life develop from non-life? Forget all the intricate stuff right now. There's no living life, now there is living life. Evolutionists like to start here where there's something happening, it's moving, and now it's going to develop. But how did life ever start from non-life? And so the only response that you can ever get is kind of like the Frankenstein theory, right? There's stuff gathering in this mud puddle, a lightning bolt hits it, and bam, it's living. The whole premise of evolution is based on something living started from something that was not living. Now, I don't have to tell you, is there any scientific support on any level at any time in human history that can even remotely underwrite that theory? There's never been anything. The closest we have come is Frankenstein. Put a couple bolts in his neck, put some wires on there, run it up to the lightning rod up on the roof, wait for a big lightning bolt to hit it. And suddenly, it's like zzz. But even Frankenstein had to have all the appropriate parts before the lightning bolt hit. Evolution is based on the premise there were no parts. Let me follow up with this question. How did systems develop to support life before that life ever existed to support the Frankenstein effect? In other words, if something's happening in a mud puddle and there's a mutation going on and DNA is being transitionalized from this to this, but the lightning bolt hasn't hit the mud puddle yet, how did those things ever develop to that stage prior to the lightning bolt hitting it? The lightning bolt was supposed to give it life and bring the DNA to life where it can begin to transition, it can begin to mutate. How was there even the simplest of system there developing prior to life being in that thing? You see, God is Alpha and Omega. Everything important in life has a beginning and an end. The Bible is very clear. Solomon was supposed to be the wisest man in the world, and he talked about seasons more than any single topic. There's a beginning, there's an end. There's a time for this, a time for that. It was supposed to be basic common sense. Everything has to have an origin that somehow logic can back up. Evolution, from its very starting point, has no starting point. It just has to say there was some kind of starting point somewhere, sometime we don't understand, can't even begin to explain it to you. Please don't even ask us about this. But at some point it started, and then once it did start, here's what we think happened. But if you can't tell me how it started, how can you tell me how it progressed from that place? Now, I can't tell you where God started from, but I can tell you that God made clear, I am Alpha and Omega. I've always been. Don't try to figure me out. But the one thing He wanted us to understand before we were, before Abraham was, He was. He's wanting us to know that before we existed, He existed. He's a starting point. That's all we need to know. There is a logical starting point. How can life develop from non-life? And how did the systems even develop to support life before that life existed to support the Frankenstein effect? If you have life, there has to be systems in place. There has to be circulatory systems. Greg, I should let you come up and teach this part. There has to be respiratory parts, pulmonary parts. There has to be skeletal parts. There has to be muscular parts. For something to be living and operating in any capacity, some of those systems on some level have to exist before the lightning bolt struck to kickstart the whole thing. How did that develop if there was no life there to begin with? Logic and reason go so far out the window that suddenly the creation story of the Bible seems very believable. It suddenly makes so much more sense. Here's a third question. I bet this is something that most of us haven't thought about. And by the way, I love this topic, and I go back every few years and I try to do a fresh research of what's going on and what people are saying, what they're thinking, what they're teaching. I try not to be too ignorant about these things, and because we've had enough ignorance in pulpits in the past where we just say stupid things that without any support at all. And this is sure one that I never thought about. And boy, there's been whole studies done behind this. With evolution, the concept, the theory of evolution, bringing random changes, how did animals keep symmetry? Let me explain that. A random process cannot produce two equal halves. Now think about this. You got something that looks like a weird-looking tadpole creature laying there. We don't know how it started. It was a mud pie and the lightning bolt hit it or something, and suddenly it's alive. It's going to genetically begin to mutate into something that looks more complex, has more parts, more systems. Science has never been able to support anything at all that can verify that in random genetic mutation, that if a creature is mutating, that come up here, Glenn, that during the mutation, that this animal here, this creature, that whatever's happening on this side of its head, the exact same thing just happens to be happening on this side of the head where you can't tell the two halves apart. There's never been any science on any level that can suggest that genetic mutation can produce symmetry. Or a dog or a cow or whatever, that this side of the body just happens to look exactly like this side of the body. How are genes randomly mutating and both sides of the body are just mutating perfectly? Because with random mutation, that means you've got this little thing on this side that's shooting out here that's trying to become an appendage of some kind, and maybe something shooting out down here and something up here. There's no form, there's no rhyme, there's no reason, because it's random mutation. Evolution's terms, not mine. It's random mutation. Random mutation does not produce symmetry. Thank you, Glenn. You're so symmetrical. I picked you because you have the prettiest head here. Random process cannot produce two equal halves. There's no science that can verify that on any level. Here's a fourth question. And you've probably thought about this because I've thought about this. With random mutation, how would gender and sexual reproduction evolve through cells transforming? Now think about this. We don't need to be that smart here. Let's just use we're West Virginians. All we need is common sense. That'll put you light years ahead of anybody in Washington, I'm telling you. Cells are randomly mutating and producing. They're being pressured through environmental changes. And by the way, if you've heard of the term adaptation, evolutionists try to play off adaptation, okay? Most of you have heard of adaptation, right? Adaptation it's a real thing. You can't deny adaptation. It really does happen. But adaptation doesn't produce something that wasn't already there. It takes something that was already in the genetic code and it begins to draw it out according to science because of environmental pressures. For example, if you take a pig and he doesn't have all that much hair and he's just got this little mouthful of teeth, and you take him and you throw him out, it's a pet pig, and you take a whole brood of them or herd of them, whatever pigs are, and you throw them out in the wild, it's going to take a while. Scientists say thousands of years, but over time, that pig's going to adapt because of environmental pressures. And suddenly he's going to begin to grow more hair than he had before. He's going to begin to grow bigger teeth than he had before. He had teeth before, they're just going to get bigger now. Pigs have tusks. Pet pigs, tame pigs, they don't get very big. Wild boar, that's wild pigs. Suddenly it changes. It's just not adaptation physically, it's adaptation mentally. That same animal, which was very passive, now becomes very aggressive over time. Now you cannot even tame that. There's no way you can take a wild boar and bring it in and try to tame that. And if you caught baby wild boar and you tried to pin them up and raise them as pets, it'd kind of be like a pit bull. You'll be taking your life in your own hands. Don't turn your back on them. Okay? Adaptation it's a reality. You can't deny adaptation. But adaptation does not change the basic DNA genetic code. Adaptation can only play off things that are already in those genetic strands. And it pulls them out because environmental pressures demands it over many generations. Okay? With that said, evolution says that mutating cells somehow have mutated and transformed to the point to where now we have gender. Now just think about this, common sense. That something that had no gender somehow now is evolving to where there are two separate genders. And it's even selecting which is going to be male and which is going to be female. Now suddenly, here's the kicker. Think about this. These things that have been coming into place because of mutation suddenly have mutated to a place of sexual reproduction where they no longer need to mutate because they can sexually reproduce and all those systems are in place. Who here tonight would say you have great enough faith to believe that? It's too big. It's too huge. The scientific concept, and I love science. I thought I was going down that road. And my mom wanted me to either be a Baptist preacher or an undertaker. She said it didn't matter. They're about the same thing. So I wanted to be an undertaker. I don't know why. I worked at a funeral home during high school. I loved being around dead bodies. And if you start putting this together with naked Barbie dolls and dead bodies, I know you're gonna end up painting a picture that may make you leave this church. But I'm curious, okay? Man, I was embalming animals. I took an aquarium pump and a bunch of bottles and all kinds of things. And what I learned from the funeral home, I learned how to make a gizmo to pump the blood out of animals and pump them full of formaldehyde, which I kind of stole from the funeral home when they weren't looking. I love science, man. I was a biology major for 2 years before I finally gave in and said, okay, we'll do it your way. I love science. I love researching this stuff. I just love the systems. And when you begin to understand these systems just a little bit, and I'm a novice compared to people. I mean, Greg is, and other people, we have a lot of people that work in the medical field here at Cornerstone. You guys understand this so much beyond me. But even with what I understand, it's just no way to buy into that these cells mutated, transformed, began to produce something male, something female. Somehow sexual reproduction systems developed, and now we don't need this process anymore because this process is going to take over. Well, how does life know that? How does life know that it doesn't need to mutate anymore? Who told it that you don't need to mutate anymore? Now we have sexual reproduction. It's pretty crazy, isn't it? Too much faith. Now you see why evolution is going by the wayside, because true scientists are looking at it going, yeah, that's not going to work. Another question. With genetic mutation, really, what are the odds of the whole internal organ system developing with such precision? What are the odds? I mean, for you and I to be alive, we have to have all these systems in place. Respiratory, circulatory. We've got to have kidneys and livers and lungs, and don't guess you need a gallbladder, but some things work a little better with one. Still not sure what the appendix does other than make doctors rich. I'm sure it does something. We've got all these things in here, and you take any one of them out, and we no longer have life. The concept that life supported itself while some of those things did not exist doesn't hold scientific water. Nobody can explain this thing was living and it didn't have this, and this, and this, and this is how it continued to live. Nobody can explain that, because the theory of evolution relies completely on people just assuming that all the gaps are filled with something logical. We just don't know what that is. And that's why it was always called the theory of evolution. Now, how many of you guys have seen the Jurassic Park movies? Remember that first one? They've got some DNA from the blood inside of a mosquito, right? The mosquitoes had been fossilized, but there was still DNA in the blood that had fossilized inside the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes, of course, had bitten what? Dinosaurs. So we've got DNA from dinosaurs inside the fossilized mosquitoes. But it's not all there. There's some missing strands. So you fill it in with what? Frog DNA, right? Because a frog is the closest thing, and a frog was one of the earliest creatures because it was in a mud puddle at one time. Had to be one of the first ones. Sure is awful good symmetry for something that formed from a mud puddle. And so the dinosaurs went crazy, and because there was unnatural things inside their DNA. So this whole thing with the DNA developing from having no systems to having systems is filled with gaps. And we fill the gaps in with frog DNA. And the frog DNA is usually just simply this. We don't know what it is, but something had to happen between this and this. And between this stage and this stage, there were 4 things that had to happen, but we don't know what those are either. We're just trusting. We just have faith to believe something happened there that we don't understand. Well, hey, we're not that far apart, are we? That's kind of where we're at as Christians, right? There's a lot of things we can't explain. The one thing we can say, though, is God. Where we don't understand, He does understand. What we can't do, He did do. The very concept that something could start from the Frankenstein effect, have life in it, but no systems to support life yet, there's no scientific basis for it. The questions that I'm posing to you tonight, they're all questions that have been verified over and over that evolutionists do not want to talk about this because it's the gaps that they say, you just got to trust us with this. Another question. This was the one that I just really focused on a few years ago. I loved microscopes in school. From the first time we were in school and we dissected a frog and we were looking at its parts under the microscope, and Mrs. Cannell, she was our chemistry teacher, And Miss Hill was our biology teacher. And it was early on, they would have all these little cool wooden boxes with slides on them. And some of this stuff was so old, you could tell. And there was all this matter on these slides, and we would look at it. And you look at the slide, it just looks like a dirty smudge. But then you look at it under the microscope, and it was so cool. And we began to learn about cells and what cells were made of and the components. And it was just so fascinating to me. It'll be much later on in college that I learned the difference between simple cells and complex cells. Complex cells is what really supports life as we would describe life. The basic concept of evolution is that whatever started out first, wherever it started, it clearly was simple cells, very simple cells. But over time, those simple cells, they mutated into complex cells. It takes complex cells to actually support life. But evolutionists will all tell you, the scientists anyway, will all tell you that there's never been one single shred of evidence that a simple cell can mutate into a complex cell. But the whole theory is based on that. So that's what I'm telling you. Out of all these questions, all you need is just one of them. Any one of them completely derails the whole theory of evolution. Another question. Where is the science backing that simple cells evolving into complex cells can reach levels that supports intelligence and emotion? No science to back it up. Now think about that for a second. Because you and I are just not living, breathing, moving creatures with all the physical parts. We have parts that do things that we don't know how to explain. Intelligence and emotion. How does something in a mud puddle struck by lightning evolve into something that supports intelligence and emotion? Not just a vast array where this living creature has this set of emotions and this type of behavior and this type of intelligence, but specific creatures with specific habits of emotion and intelligence. How come every creature that mutated into this over here, this wildebeest, they all seem to have the same nature? How convenient. Human beings all sharing the same smorgasbord of emotions and intelligence. Something that would take very complex cells. No science to support those complex cells that support something that complicated could ever come from a simple cell. And yet evolution is based on the premise somehow that had to have happened. Have no idea how, can't prove it, but we want you to believe that that somehow happened. One last question. And I told you what adaptation is, okay? Though adaptation is clearly supported by science and life itself, why does the process of evolution seem to be no longer in motion? Adaptation still is. In fact, if you take any one of you, if I take Alan back here, he's a true man's man, and I take him and I drop him off on a deserted island somewhere. Even in his lifetime, even though true adaptation takes many, many, many generations, even in his lifetime, if he has 30 years left on that island, you'll be shocked at the adaptation process that takes place in his life. He's probably going to start growing a little more hair, and his behavior is going to change. The muscle tone may change because he's having to adapt due to environmental pressures. We know that. Nobody with any intelligence at all is going to argue with adaptation. But why has the process of evolution suddenly come to a shutdown? How come when we look back as far as we can, going back to the fossil age, but just on this side of the fossil age, how come we don't see any new critters? We see no new creatures. Things are adapting, but nothing's changing. DNA codes are staying exactly the way they are. If it was, how come it isn't now? Would you all agree with me that may be the most common sense question of all to pose to an evolutionist? If it did happen, how come it is not happening? And I think it's a valid question. I shared with you guys a few weeks ago, I don't know if it was here or Sunday morning or where it was at, but I was talking about when we went to D.C. this summer, and we hit the Natural History Museum first thing because last time we went, Hannah was a little smaller. It was towards the end of the day. She was so grouchy. She wanted an ice cream cone, and I'm trying to show her T-Rex bones, and all that kid cared about was an ice cream cone, and I was so brokenhearted because it's like, I want you to be a scientist. This time we hit the Natural History Museum first thing and hit the dinosaur section first. It's like, this is where we're starting because this is the good stuff here, and we'll be the only Christians in here because all the rest of them are in denial. They think someone just poured this stuff out of concrete or something, or that they were on the ark because the ark was really big enough to hold all the dinosaurs. No, the dinosaurs would be considered unclean creatures. Okay, there's a bunch of them. Some of them may have been considered clean creatures. There was a pair of the unclean. How many of the clean? 7. So there's more creatures on the ark than what you may have thought. I don't know. Brontosaurus seems like a clean creature to me. Vegetarian. I mean, come on. If you can milk one of those suckers, buddy, you'd have milk for a month. Just saying. I told you that when we went to the exhibit that showed the evolution of humanoids, that they had this collection of skulls, and I told Hannah before I went, I said, now, baby, I want to explain to you before we go in here what you're going to see, and I want to explain to you what they're thinking versus what we believe. And she said she understood, and I went and I began to point out to her, began to show her the shapes of the skulls and everything of the prehistoric humanoids and their little tiny skeletons and their little tiny skulls and stuff like that. And we looked at all the other skeletons from the apes and the monkeys, and it took Hannah, an 11-year-old, to point out the obvious. She said, Daddy, these skulls here that they say were humans, they look like the monkey skulls, not like the human skulls. She said, couldn't they just been monkeys? I said, yeah, baby, but don't try to interweave logic into this. You're in the wrong place. Now, those skeletons were real. I'm not in denial that those skeletons, they were real. I also understand that creatures become extinct. And that there's a whole lot of critters that used to be on this earth that are not on this earth anymore. And we find the skeletal remains, and we find a lot of fossils. But it's kind of a stretch to take an ape and say, oh, that was one of the early men. Just because somebody who called themselves a scientist said that was an early man. Yeah, he was only 4 feet tall, and the way that his jaw juts out, yeah, I know it looks more like a monkey or an ape than a man, but trust us, it was an early man. Because as we know, all they have to say is, scientists have learned, and suddenly it's true, right? And if it's on the internet, you know it's true. Though adaptation is clearly supported by science and life itself, why has the process of evolution seemingly ceased in motion? Charles Darwin, there's been folklore about him in a deathbed confession and him renouncing evolution. It's not true, by the way, if you've ever been told that. It was propagated. was propagated by a lady named Lady Hope. She was the husband of Lord Hope, and they were good friends of the Darwins in England. And she was a devout Christian, and the Darwins were not. Charles, as he got older, he mellowed out a lot, and he actually allowed people to build a church on his property. And he asked them, he began to hear their songs, their old hymns and stuff, and he asked them if they would leave the windows open on the church when they were having church, because he enjoyed hearing the hymns. But there was never any proof that he actually gave his life to the Lord. His wife, Anne, on the other hand, was a devout atheist, and she wasn't just an atheist. For some reason, something happened in her early years, and she hated Christians. She hated the church. And when Charles died, Lady Hope started spreading around that Charles had renounced evolution on his deathbed and given his life to Jesus. And his wife, Anne, and Charles's daughter both said, look, she wasn't even in here. She wasn't in the room. She was nowhere to be found. She's making this up. We were here. Trust us. This man did not change anything. I have no reason to believe that Charles Darwin renounced evolution. There's no proof of that. However, once when Charles Darwin was being approached by somebody concerning evolution in an innocent way, he began to challenge Darwin on the complexities of life systems, and just challenge him on how can you justify this and this, and how do you fill these gaps in. And he began to challenge him on the human eye. The human eye that constricts and contracts and expands and does all kinds of things to pull in light, where it can gather things into images. It takes those images and somehow it fires them through electronic impulses to the brain, and now somehow the brain is connecting with these eyes and what the eyes are doing. And the question was just asked to Darwin, how does something that complex come into being through mutation? And this is what Charles Darwin said, and it is on record. And I've left some of it out and compressed some of it because it was a little longer than this. To suppose the eye in all its complexity, together light, focus, and send images neurotically to the brain, was formed by natural selection, I freely confess, is absurd. Well, the whole theory was absurd. Because with all the complexities of the eye, it's no more complex than the respiratory system or the circulatory system. The pulmonary system, is that part of the same of the circulatory? I don't know. I just know there's all kinds of parts in there, and they're very complicated. And I don't understand that. I don't know how I just did that. I didn't even really have that much of a thought. I'm not even saying hand raise. The thought is so instant that I'm doing things here and I'm not even thinking about it. How do these abilities evolve from gene mutation and natural selection? Most true evolutionist scientists are self-confessed that their theory has many, many gaps with no scientific answers. But I want to remind you what makes perfect sense. It's not just some silly religious thing. It's not just some silly faith. I want to remind you there is only one thing in life that makes sense. And that's the story of God's Word. That God made man in His image. And He made plants, and He made the animals of the air and the sea and of the land. And He made them to reproduce after their own kind. Something that's been in motion for, we understand, at least 6,000 years, at least. And nothing has deviated from that. If you're a person that sometimes you think about these things and you go, well, maybe they are right. I'm not sure. This God thing, it takes a lot of faith. And what if we're wrong? I'm here to remind you tonight, there is no theory B or plan B that even makes this much sense. This may be a bucket that has a few holes in it as far as needing faith to plug those holes. But I want to remind you that all the other buckets, it's basically a handle holding on to a hole. There's no bucket there. You need to let that undergird your faith, because if that's true, and the story of creation in the Bible is true, which makes God true, that means all the rest of it is also true. And now it has to own us. It has to dictate our life. It has to rule us. Every decision we make, every action, every reaction has to be processed through this, because this is as true as the creation story itself. It's a filter that will radically change your lifestyle, and not in a labor-intensive, restrictive bondage way, but in a real freedom way where you can relax in life and know God's got this. He always did have it. It's all good. I thank you tonight, Father, for your word. You understood, Lord, that basic faith had to start with creation. Lord, wherever our faith has went since, it all had to start with believing that you are the creator of the universe. There's nowhere to go with you as Savior or Lord or King or healer or provider or anything. We can't take it anywhere until it is established that you are our creator, that all this exists by you. And if, Lord, we believe it exists by you, then we have to now say, and it exists for you. And that affects us, Lord. It challenges us. And so I thank you for the reminder of truth tonight that makes so much sense to us. And your Spirit confirms it and confirms it and confirms it. And we're reminded tonight, Lord, that human intellect and science does nothing to tear our faith down. May we leave here, Lord, more sure of who you are than we ever have in our life. And may we leave here a little better armed, maybe, Lord, to have some conversations with some people that maybe are wrestling with some of these things. That, Lord, we won't fight, but we can have logical conversations that would challenge people and make them think. And I'll probably talk to you later on tonight, but that's all I got to say for now. All right, I hope Miss Pam is happy. I've done the best I can. She says 8:15, it's 8:14. Go retrieve your children. Love you guys. Bless you.